Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another webinar series. The GESI webinar series serves as a platform for the GESI network members to share experience and expertise in evidence synthesis and share potential collaboration. As you see, you are all muted by default. So if you want to ask your question, please raise your hand to be unmuted so that you can ask your question directly to the presenter, or you can submit your questions and comments using the question panel. For those who are joining us for the first time, an overview of the Stakeholder Engagement webinar series. Stakeholder engagement is an integral part of all systematic reviews to some degree. However, there has been a little discussion of this important process in systematic review guidance to date, particularly in the field of environmental management and conservation. This series discusses various aspects of engaging with stakeholders, like describing the ranges of methods available, outlining experiences from various systematic review experts, and discussing issues related to conflict. The benefits of training, engaging directly with decision makers, and communicating review results. So today's webinar series is the second webinar in the Stakeholder Engagement webinar series, and it's about managing knowledge production in context of conflict by Dr. Annika Nilsson. So Dr. Annika Nilsson is an interdisciplinary researcher focusing on the politics of Arctic change, environmental governance, and the co-production of knowledge at the science policy interface. She works as an independent researcher, including engagement with KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden and the Nordland Research Institute in Norway. She has recently been engaged in the Arctic Council's Arctic Resilience Assessment and in the Barents region study for Adaptation Action for a Changing Arctic. Dr. Nilsson has a PhD in environmental science, as well as over 20 years of professional experience as a science writer before entering academia. Once again, thank you, Dr. Nilsson, for joining us today.
I'm very happy that you're joining today, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to meet with you. I have not worked that much with systematic reviews. Hadaway drew me into some work, but my experience really comes from other fields. I'm more of a sometimes I call myself an undisciplined researcher, but towards the political science field, and as Nadia said, with an interest in politics of Arctic change. But I've worked with several scientific assessment processes relating to pollution in the Arctic and social issues in the Arctic, and also in my own research looked at knowledge production about climate change in the Arctic. And scientific assessments, in a sense, have many similarities to systematic reviews in that they build on a strong belief in knowledge as an important input in policy making and decision making. And while I fully agree on the importance of knowledge for good decisions, I wouldn't question that. It's important to remember that knowledge is really only one aspect of decision making, and one aspect that needs to inform decision making in society. And maybe even more important, knowledge is often contested, even if it's based on available scientific evidence. And in some cases, even the knowledge production process as such, the scientific process, is contested. There used to be a notion that all would be well if only science could speak truth to power. But we know today from many studies of the science policy interface that the picture is much more complex, and actually from my perspective more interesting, but I study these processes. For those of you who try to influence policy and try to systematize available knowledge, it just makes it more challenging. But it has implications for the power of systematic reviews and for the role of systematic reviews, not least in relation to stakeholder engagement, which of course is the topic for this seminar series. And as Nadia said, I'm a researcher at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden and mainly engaged in a Nordic Center of Excellence working on issues related to resource extraction and sustainable Arctic communities. And I will take some of the examples from that field today, because it is definitely one in which knowledge and contested issues and conflicts are very much in place. But before going into the details, I want to give a little bit more of the context we're moving in and why the topic of looking at stakeholder engagement as part of a contested knowledge issue is very relevant at this moment in time. I would argue that we have today a shifting landscape of contested futures. And if we go back in time, it seems, if we go back in time a long time, things seem to be just continue as they were. If we go back in time, maybe 30 years, there was a notion that everything is progress, everything is going to be better. Today, we live in a time where that's not so easy to say anymore. We live in a times of very rapid social and environmental change where the ground is shaking. And that means that the future is being renegotiated. So we kind of so where do we want to go? And the stakes are quite high. It's not as if we can get everything we want. And that creates, in a sense, a tense situation in and of itself. Where you also have a situation where common aspirations, such as getting better material welfare, being able to travel, everyone having a good economy, is no longer seen as sustainable, at least not the way it has been practiced by Western countries so far. And that, of course, challenges the people who are in power today, the people who are in a good situation today. So new knowledge, for example, about environmental change and impact, and the impact of and the consequences of the decisions and the lifestyle we have, that type of information is actually often perceived as an existential threat. It's not just new neutral information, it challenges people to question their life choices and their lifestyles, and sometimes even their identity. We also live at a time where power relations are shifting in many different ways. In geopolitical power relations are shifting towards Asia compared to the old world, but also among generations. Young generation, large populace of young generation coming with different values, different ideals. We see this in Sweden, which is where I sit, with Greta Thunberg and her challenging politicians about why aren't you doing anything about climate change, and getting young people all over the world to actually call on the older generation. So what are you doing? You're destroying our future. So that is, and that those people are in voting power in not too many years. And on top of it, we have a virtual media landscapes that creates completely new conditions for communication, much more rapid, but also creating media bubbles. So we live in a completely different landscape than I would say 20, 30 years ago, which is when I started working on these issues. And that means that also knowledge becomes contested. And there is a renegotiation of the role of science in society. And that creates a need to recognize what science can do and what it cannot do, and thereby also, I would say, what systematic reviews can do and what they cannot do. first of all, and this is something Sheila Jasanoff has written a lot about. I put one reference in the end slide. I have the full references for these papers that are kind of cornerstone papers in the development of this thinking. Is we have to recognize that knowledge is not something neutral, objective that's there. It's something that is negotiated and co-constructed in a dialogue between whatever we are studying, whether it's a ecosystem or a society, and those who are studying it, whether those are researchers, whether it's politicians or whoever. It's that knowledge comes out of a relationship where people are involved, not only people, but also institutional structures. And while it might be possible to answer a specific scientific question in a reasonably objective manner, the body of knowledge that is produced and highlighted in political decision-making is a product of a number of social and political processes, ranging from science funding, the organization of academia, power relations in society. And that is, I think, fairly well recognized now by many people, but not necessarily by people who work in hardcore natural sciences, where it's seen as something bad, whereas when I describe it, it's more an observation of that's how it functions. It's not, I don't put a value in it that it would be negative, that's the case. But it also means that it becomes very difficult to make a clear distinction between what is a stakeholder and what is a knowledge producer. In the previous webinar in the series, Neil Hadaway gave a more general introduction to stakeholder engagement, and I assume some of you have listened to that as well. And here I want to highlight that it's not really possible to differentiate between the knowledge producers and stakeholders. What you may call stakeholders are also knowledge providers, or at least knowledge holders, while those who you may recognize as experts very often have their own stake in the process and in the knowledge production processes, whether it be systematic review or empirical research. These things can, for example, be related to career or other social rewards, not only what you may initially think of as stakes in a political issue. So who is a knowledge producer and who is a stakeholder requires some reflection. Third, and this is something that comes very much from insights from studying scientific assessment. There was a large project that global environmental assessments, looking at them, evaluating them, which was reported by Mitchell et al. In 2006, that scientific credibility is not sufficient, but that it must be accompanied also by salience and process legitimacy. And it came from an observation that you have loads of scientific assessments, but only a few of them actually have an impact on policy. And even if they had very high scientific credibility, it did not guarantee having any impact. And what they showed by looking at many of these processes, both internationally and in national context, is that, and this one is probably fairly obvious to you, that the question posed by the assessment have to be seen as relevant, as salient to the people who you're trying to reach. And that might be pretty obvious. What might be less recognized is that the knowledge production process must be perceived as legitimate. And what is legitimate depends on who you ask. For a scientist, a natural science person, the scientific process itself creates legitimacy. And in the systematic review processes, we tend to think of that the transparency and the systematic matter of a review process would create a process legitimacy. But that's not necessarily true for all audiences. For example, it might not be relevant for an audience who would rely on an oral tradition as more legitimate than written evidence. So what is a legitimate process depends who you're trying to reach. And unfortunately, what is credible, salient, and legitimate to one target audience may not be equally credible, salient, and legitimate to another target audience who also need to be convinced. So, but looking at these three aspects at least makes you think of what you have to have in mind and try to look at your own process from the outside, from the view of who you're trying to reach. And I think one of the things that I have had to think hard about more and more, having my own background comes from actually being a science journalist initially and having worked with science communication. And I think we have been a bit naive that if we can only come with new tools and approaches and flashier way of presenting our material and better language, we would be able to reach. But I come to realize that that's not where the problem is often. The problem lies somewhere else. It's not a matter of being a good communicator only. So we need to critically assess how we think about science communication. And we need to think about it in the very beginning of the knowledge production process. It's not a matter of translating scientific results to flashy, usable language for decision makers. And on top of it, sometimes something that I mentioned earlier, we live in a time where you have media bubbles that create parallel knowledge landscapes and fact resistance. And various different groups frame the whole issue in different ways. There are several examples of that are quite well studied in the view of vaccinations. Child vaccination is very clear examples where you have a strong scientific basis and strong public health incentives to vaccinate for many of what's called childhood diseases, while also quite a substantial group of people, well-educated people, don't believe in it, don't believe those messages. And of course, climate change is another classic, where there's also quite a bit of research showing how that links the media bubbles and the knowledge resistant links to political ideologies. So we need to be humble. We also need to be humble about the limits of science and limits of knowledge. Science cannot solve all of society's challenges. It can only address specific questions, and the questions posed also depends on who has power to pose questions. And but what questions are not posed because they're not scientific. And we need to think about, can knowledge really be objective in an unequal world where some actors have a voice, do not have a voice in defining what is relevant? This photo is from the Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Kiruna in Sweden in 2013. The Arctic Council is a collaboration among the 8 Arctic countries in the circumpolar north. But it also shows the diplomatic car coming, and you have representatives of the Sami community in the background saying no Arctic mining. And what the power relations in these pictures are quite obvious, and they were also obvious actually inside the meeting where I happened to be. And it goes behind a scientific question. It comes in a history of colonialism, questions about human rights, indigenous people's rights, that includes not only the explicit political processes weighing conflicting interests against each other, but also power of defining what knowledge is and what knowledge is relevant when assessing the impacts of mining. So the link, sometimes there used to be, oh, we need to keep science and politics apart, but you can't. They're always intertwined. And we need to recognize the limits of science and that some issues are political at their core. And as I mentioned, I have some examples here from resource extraction in the Arctic based on ongoing research in 2 projects. One is within the Nordic Center of Excellence, REX, Resource Extraction and Sustainable Arctic Communities. And the other is a project where I was involved at the start, which is focusing on mapping the impacts of mining using multiple knowledges, where a systematic review of published literature, kind of rather classic in the systematic review sense, is only one aspect, and where another aspect is empirical work together with the Sami reindeer herding community to gather their knowledge that is often not written down or documented, and actually often dismissed as just feelings or opinions, especially when you start getting in situations where it's contested land use. A company wants to open a mine on land that has traditionally been used for reindeer herding, for example. In REXAC, one question relates to the need to reform processes related to environmental impact assessment. And currently the focus is quite local, and the emphasis on potential impacts on the environment, such as water, soil, air, and biodiversity at the kind of biotope and species level. And if you look at these, the social and economic aspects are not discussed in at all the same detail. That knowledge is not weighed in, counted. Another question is what scale should be in focus. Is it the very local impacts of mining, of the kind of close vicinity to a mine, or is it the large scale system that the fact that the mine generates the building of roads and railroads, requires energy, has maybe pollution that's transported via river far downstream, all of these issues. Where you draw the line for where the environmental impact assessment that the company has to do should be responsible, even if it's not in control of the mining companies. And even questions such as, when we talk about economic consequences, should the focus be on the national economy the next 10 years or the local economy in the next 100 years? And these are questions that go to the heart of how we define sustainable development, where the local focus currently is often not very well articulated. For the 3MK project, and by now you had a chance to look at it a little bit, I invite you to take a close look at the lower image here. What do you see? I mean, it's contradictory information, but even if you recognize that after a while, it usually takes a little while before you see it. Your eye is drawn to one picture, but not the other. And you could equally say, is it drawn to people needing jobs that would come from a mine, or is it people having their livelihoods threatened, such as reindeer herders? Or do you see another small detail in an environment that's already encroached and maybe you think destroyed, or is it actually doing something to a pristine environment? Are you looking at a local system or a global system? So these are some examples of how knowledge is not as simple as one would want it to be. And I want to, since my guess is that most of you may not come from a background of philosophy of science, I want to place what I have discussed far into a framework of more theoretical understanding of the role of science in society. An early recognition of the complexity of knowledge in relation to decision making came with the notion of wicked problems. It comes from Rittel and Weber in 1973, which really was a way to describe what calls problems that have multiple causes, maybe nonlinear dynamics, often lacking definitive solutions and linked to alternative policy frames. Climate change is a very, very good example of a wicked problems. You cannot describe it in a simple science. You cannot reduce it to one single scientific question that you can answer. You can, certain aspects of it, you can, the atmospheric dynamics you can study with scientific methods. You cannot address the whole problem of climate change in society with only scientific methods. It's too complex. A next step, in a sense, in the recognition of the complexity and the role of science in society, what's called post-normal science, a notion that Fentowitz and Ravitz wrote about in 1993. And they really focused on then scientific management of uncertainty. They recognize the wicked problems. So what does one do with it? What do you do it as a scientist with something like this? But they remain within the scientific paradigm, and but add then a commitment to solving it with specific activities and dialogue, for example, management of uncertainty that is inevitable. I think IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a very good example of a body that was created with that kind of thinking in mind. You have all kinds of examples of how they try to manage uncertainty while staying within a scientific paradigm, and even if it's a very much of a science policy interface, trying to safeguard the scientific credibility by always managing that interface. However, I think what we see now is that the very role and status of science and society is challenged. And it's, of course, very problematic in the sense of the consequences of fact resistance, some of which I mentioned earlier. But one could also turn around and see it as positive. That is also recognition of alternative epistemologies, alternative ways of knowing, for example, the upgrading of local and indigenous knowledge, and the kind of the recognition that scientific methods are not the only ways of knowing, and that each way of knowing has its kind of strengths and weaknesses, so you can start having a dialogue around that. That's the positive aspect of it, but of course you have to get to the dialogue in order to get the positive aspects and not get stuck in the fact resistance and all that. So then what are the implications of all of this for systematic reviews? You might think that this was kind of a detour for what you're really interested in systematic reviews. So in this, what we tried to do, me together with a colleague, Rasmus Klokke Larsen, we tried to put this all into a kind of a heuristic framework that could help guiding systematic reviews, and this is published, and you can find it. You get the reference at the end. So what I would like to do is kind of go around this circle, and the important is to think of where are you, what kind of problem do you have when you're, what kind of problem do you want to address, and how do you have to think when you think about stakeholder involvement and kind of knowledge production in general. So starting in the lower right corner, what type of conflicts are you talking about? We can start in the beginning. Is it a knowledge-based conflict? Well, then normal science and systematic reviews might serve you quite well, especially if you can define the the issue clearly enough. However, if it's a wicked problem, you might have to think differently. And going in the inner circle, if it is a knowledge-based problem, the stakeholder involvement might be more of a consultation. Objectivity might be relevant to talk about, and generality becomes a measure of quality. However, if it's a wicked problem, now I have to think of which direction I'm going. Because I don't see the whole picture in my my screen, so I have to look at a paper. If you go one step up and look at post-normal science, you have a more wicked problem, a recognition that it's co-constructed. Your view on knowledge, you get a different view on knowledge that you have to take into account. And the measure of quality here would be stakeholder relevance, maybe more than, or not instead of, but in addition to what you would think of as scientific quality. It's not just any scientific study that's relevant to include. It's one that actually addresses the issue that needs to be addressed according to stakeholders. And your stakeholder involvement, the goal might be to think of social learning. How do you create a process in which the various actors can actually learn from each other? Which is a different type of task than only consulting them and asking them for something. You might have to create a workshop setting. You might have to create a social trust that actually makes it possible to learn. If we then go to the outer circle and end up in a situation where you have a destructive conflict, and I will go into different kinds of conflicts later, but a destructive conflict is one that is no one really wants, and it's not moving anything forward. It's not helping anyone. You might have different views on what knowledge actually is, or what knowledge is relevant. Some might think certain knowledge is just feelings or myths, or that other knowledge is some kind of bogus science. And when it comes to measures of quality, then you might have to think of, can you at least get to a point where you can get a mutual recognition and a common sense of what we're talking about, to get beyond where you are in a situation of a destructive conflict, get into a constructive conflict where you can start teasing it apart and actually move forward. And in stakeholder involvement, you might have to think of, what are the power relations between different groups? Can you create a situation where everyone actually has a chance to speak and share their knowledge and perspectives? What does equality in practice mean? Does it mean changing the settings? Rasmus Klokke-Larsen, for example, has worked with doing assessments, impact assessment together with the Sami community without anyone from the outside, in a facilitated process where you can kind of isolate at one point in time from a situation where it's actually quite conflictual. But that, of course, also requires resources, and it's a question of who has resources to put into the process. So that's what equality in practice is. And there you can think of all kinds of dimensions. It can be gender dimensions, it can be different ethnic groups, it can be different practices, it can be different countries. There are all kinds of dimensions that need to be taken into account when looking at equality in practice. And as I said, conflicts can have many different dimensions, and here are some to help you sort out what might be relevant. Is it that you can think of when you consider whether to do a systematic review and when consider planning it, is it a destructive or a constructive conflict that you're dealing with? If a destructive conflict and people aren't talking to each other and they're ready to hit each other in the head, it might be a different approach that you need to take than if you already have a constructive dialogue. And it's a matter of looking more specifically at finding facts. Is it based on different facts or different knowledges? Is it a knowledge-based conflict to start with, or is it a different type of conflict? Maybe conflict based on interests, or is it maybe based on different perceptions of reality? Or as I said, incommensurable specific interest. If you have a piece of land in northern Sweden, you cannot use the same piece of land for a mine, for reindeer herding, and for tourism and for wind power. Those interests are likely to be incommensurable. You cannot solve that with more knowledge. It's a political process that has to be carried out that can move that forward. And then we have the more loaded issues. Is the conflict based on perceptions of past wrongdoings? Colonial heritage does play a role in northern, across the Arctic, and I think in many other parts of the world. What does that do to the discussion? And linked to that, what role and sense of power or powerlessness are there among the participants, both past and present? And what role do emotions play? And that can be hope, or we really want to invest in this mine because we're going to earn a lot of money, and that will not only be good for a company, but it could even be important for a country. In the case of Greenland, for example, as a means towards independence from Denmark. So really high stakes. Or fear of losing your livelihood, fear of losing your place of where you live, fear of losing something that's important to your identity. And I think having reflecting on what kind of conflict you're dealing with can narrow down what a systematic review in the classical sense can actually be useful for, and what it cannot be useful for, and where there might be other means of moving further. And this is, in a sense, a summary of some of the things I've said that you can use, in a sense, as a guide. Summary of the two previous pictures, previous slides. You can use this guide for doing that assessment yourself before starting a systematic review. Is the question one well defined, closed framed, or is it a wicked problem? Is it potentially irreconcilable problem definition, or coexisting diverging questions? Is the evidence there in published scientific gray literature, or can be gathered from quantitative or qualitative scientific analysis? Or is it a matter of filling primary data gaps highlighted by stakeholders, exploring interpretations through social learning? Or do you actually have to start a whole new process of generating evidence in joint fact findings? And that might not be then a systematic review process in more classical definition. And the review team then has different roles. In the normal science column, it's experts and scientific independence becomes important, whereas in a post-normal science involving stakeholders in framing the whole process, making it legitimate, for example, by identifying research questions and seeking consensus, becomes important. Whereas in a conflict management situation, you have to be careful to try to force a consensus, which the risk is that some people will walk out. And instead involving stakeholders directly in answering the questions, which then becomes kind of contradictory to some of the norms in systematic reviews of scientific independence. So you can see here where systematic review may not be the relevant tool to move forward in an issue where you have a contest. What do you think it might be about contested knowledge? And the stakeholder group also comes very different roles. Is it you only consult them about something you already know what you're doing, or do they actually have decision-making authority and early involvement in the planning, or they might not form a group at all and might have several different meetings because they don't talk to each other in a productive manner. And you might have to have expertise in facilitation to get equality in practice, actually getting everyone a chance to be heard. I talked a lot about stakeholders, and I had this slide first in the beginning, and now then I moved it to the end. But I think it's also important to think who is a stakeholder is. Is it knowledge users, which is the more classical way of thinking about it, or affected parties, directly or indirectly, or a knowledge provider? And as earlier I said, the line between knowledge provider and stakeholders is not necessarily so clear. And we also have to think of what status different stakeholders have. They have legal rights and sharp rules about consultation. That can sometimes, not in all countries, but sometimes be the case in environmental impact assessment, but not in all countries. It varies. Do they have rights by ethical norms, such as human rights, indigenous people's rights, not sharp legal requirements? Or maybe they have a status by the power, economic, political, or brute force power. The companies, for example, or maybe by soft means, they can affect your reputation by shaming or endorsing you. So there you have to think about different roles of stakeholders. And then, in summary, I'm reasonably in time, I see, to summarize, and this is repetition of what the question that you might want to keep in mind in planning for a systematic review in an issue area where some conflicts could be an issue. Is the issue in focus mainly about knowledge or facts that can be assessed in a systematic manner, or does it include other dimensions, such as conflicting interests, conflicting worldviews? What role can your review process play in a larger context of the issue at hand? You're not the only knowledge process. You're not the only process that's possible to take. And in assessing that, is the systematic review likely to reduce or exacerbate conflicts? How will the larger context affect your credibility and legitimacy of your review process? And you should never assume that it's neutral. You go in there and you might think you're objective and neutral, but you affect the context, you affect the situation. And that's, of course, often the ambition. What's the point otherwise of doing the work? But it's easy as a scientist to think that you're neutral when you aren't. And you might also want to think about what other processes regarding knowledge and power can you affect and be affected by. So that is in summary, and here are some of the cited literature and resources that I mentioned, and you will get the slides, so you will have this in your inbox or however that is being distributed, so you don't have to sit and try to copy it. And here's just where you can reach me, and at rexac.org you can see, if you're interested specifically in Arctic resources and extractive industries, you can see a little bit about what we're doing in that project. So that's it. and I'm very open for your questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Annika Nilsson. This was a very interesting presentation. So we will take questions right now. Hello, Mahmoud?
Yes, hello. Are you listening to me?
Yes,
we
we
can
hear
hear you.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for this wonderful talk, actually. It's very constructive, and I got one comment here. Well, I agree with the speaker regarding to implementation this engagement framework and from the high level perspective. It sounds good if you like implementing this framework in Sweden or European country, but I can see it's very challenging when it comes to LOMIC. Since we have faced a lot of issues regarding to limited access to like published literature in adequate human resource and health research. We got like lack of funding, and also we got problem that everybody knows that's knowledge translation deficit issue. So I didn't know, this is my first comment, I didn't know how this fit from the high LOMIC perspective, from LOMIC perspective. My second question is back to your theoretical framework, which is good. Actually, there's two components here when you speak about the view of knowledge. I couldn't see the cultural perspective here. So where the cultural, transcultural issue fit in that model. And also, you speak nicely about how you, in terms of a process, how you involve with the stakeholder involvement. But I couldn't see.
What did you say? Can you repeat what you said? Just you can see.
Sorry. So back to your model. So yeah, I got two issues in your models here that I need to ask. So you in your model there's a way, the process of viewing knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And the other, yeah, so you get, and the other one is how to stakeholder involvement.
Mm-hmm.
But as you can see in your model, I couldn't see that. I'm talking from like LOMIC perspective, where the cultural and transcultural issue will fit
Mm-hmm.
in terms of So I couldn't see that in terms of viewing the knowledge, because I would say that cultural issues will impact definitely the way of people or scientists to view the knowledge. Other issue is regarding to the stakeholder involvement. So in LOMIC perspective, we got like poverty, social injustice. It's a big dilemma to involve literacy, low education, low socioeconomics. So where empowerment could fit. So what I'm just summarizing and conclude what I'm trying to say here is that it's that model will be definitely fit in high LOMIC. It's very applicable, but when it comes to apply what you have said in LOMIC perspective, it's very challenging at the moment. So we need to like working to modify. I'm not saying modify, but we need to find the solutions or how this brilliant. Actually, I like the framework. Actually, I like it so much. But in terms whether it's fit to LOMIC perspective, like I'm talking from South Africa. I didn't introduce myself. So I'm from University of Cape Town, Department of Medicine, Evidence-Based Research Unit. So I can see I'm so from
I
so
very much
that's
like your question, and let's see if I can. I think the transcultural issue. It's not explicit in here. I agree with that, and it could be made much more explicit. But actually, the transcultural issue is very much present in the context of the Arctic in relation, for example, to indigenous peoples and larger society. And I think what one could think of is elaborating, because you have the transcultural issue. There are both in a sense can be view of knowledge can look very different worldviews to start with, but also things like what do what you see as quality in one culture is not necessarily the same thing as you see as quality in another. So I think I agree with you. You could, in a sense, the transcultural issue applies to several aspects here and could be brought out much stronger than we did in our article. And when it comes to issues of social injustice and illiteracy, I think that can very much be elaborated further than I did when you talk about equality in practice, because that actually refers to the thing that you can't, it's not enough to, or you send out invitations to take part in something. Some people have no possibility to take part in it, even if they would want to, because they can't leave their job, because they have to earn a living. How do you then create a situation that actually makes it possible for them to take part? And that of course is context specific. You can't provide one answer for South Africa that's also relevant for Northern Sweden. You have to know the social context in which you're working to and that I think is true also when you talk about social learning. How do you create a setting where people actually can listen and talk to each other in a constructive manner? That is not the same in Stockholm, Sweden, in Northern Sweden, or in South Africa. You have to know the cultural context you're in. So I very much agree with it. And those are things that I think would be should be elaborated on further. I agree with you there.
Thank you very much. That's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud, for your question.
And of course, these are often not things that you can, it's not simple questions, more to put thoughts in your head that you probably need to think about and mull over and discuss with your colleagues. And as the previous person talked about, you have to discuss it with your colleagues in the specific context that where you're working, whether it's the cultural context or the type of issue you're asking.
So we have
and
Monica.
I think that's my point in reflect.
So we have Monica Morrison who wants to ask a question. Monica, can you hear us?
Very much, really, really useful and relevant. I'm working in northern Botswana, where we currently have the issue of elephant control and management. So all of this is speaking to what's going on here. But what I wanted to ask you was how important is it to have transdisciplinary teams? And when you're looking at something so complex as planning a systematic review at all of these stages, and possibly at the outermost ring, which is heavily conflicted, who does what? Where do you start? You're putting together a team to do this.
Now you disappeared the end of your question, but I got as far as who do you involve in planning these kinds of projects? And I think, I mean, the thing is, I think, to realize that it's not sufficient with expertise in the specific question, in scientific question. You need, in a sense, expertise in the cultural context you're working. That could be local involvement in and of itself, or it can be, in some context, maybe someone in anthropology, or it can also be someone with expertise in facilitation. How do you run a workshop in a specific context so it works? That is knowledge in and of itself. In the 3MK project, we're quite a diverse group. I'm not involved anymore because I've left SEI where the project is, but we had some people who are experts in systematic reviews and the methodology. We have one person, Rasmus Klokke Larsen, my colleague, who is co-author of the article, who has worked very closely with Sami communities directly, and has worked a lot with facilitation issues. And then I was involved, in a sense, looking at the stakeholder mapping and doing those kinds of work initially. But I think I think a good way of start is to actually ask yourself, what type of knowledge do I need? And think broader than relating to the question, and think about the process. You need knowledge about how to set up the process. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Annika. Monica, we're sorry we lost you at the end, so I hope Dr. Annika answered your question. But you can always contact her through her email, as she said.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have other questions. So thank you, Dr. Annika, for being here with us for this webinar.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. It was, and I really appreciate the questions that came. It made me also have to think further. That's what's nice.
That's what's nice. And thank you everybody for joining us today. So please stay tuned for the coming stakeholder engagement webinar series next month up until February 2020. Thank you.
Bye.